Welcome to Chapter 3 of Complete Cubase 8.5. Now, this chapter is going to focus primarily on the major components of Cubase, their relationship, and then we're going to do a deep dive on Media Bay and the pool, as well as an up-close look at the project window in particular. Along the way, we're going to be making use of the workspaces function, which you may or may not be familiar with. Workspaces are really just desktop presets. They allow you to configure your stuff the way you want it and then save that under a given name. Makes it very easy to reconfigure your desktop in one click for, say, a setup that's one way for recording, a second way for editing, and a third for mixdown and so forth. And we're going to start with the project window. Of all the major components, we're going to look at what I call the big three, which are the project window, the mix console, and the channel editor. But everything really starts with this. The project window is your project. And in fact, if you try to close the project window, it's going to ask you whether or not you want to save, because at this point you're putting the entire thing away. Now, the project window is where you're going to spend most of your time during recording, as opposed to the mix console, which is where you'll spend your time during the mix down and export phase. So let's change this to the major players. And here we have all three: the channel settings editor, the mix console, and we're going to just touch on this today because we've got two whole chapters on the mix console coming up later, and then the project window itself. These are your three major players. If you're relatively new to Cubase, you're going to spend 75 to 80% of your time in one of these three windows when you're starting out. Now, there are tons others. If we open up calling all devices, there's just a ton of stuff in here that you could be interacting with, and we'll touch on each of these throughout the videos as we need to. But your primary players are these three: your project window, mix console, and channel editor. Now, having said that, there are two others that are really important that I want to take just a moment to look at, and those are going to be to add in the media bay and your pool or project pool. Now, I've got media bay here in the standalone window. Let me maximize that. And this is really the mothership for all of Cubase in the background in terms of where all your material's stored and accessed and so forth. And we're going to do an entire chapter just on Media Bay. We'll get to that later. And then there is this other window called a pool. Maximize that. And you can see at first sight, these both seem a little bit intimidating and very similar. You've got just tons of waveforms and audio files, and they sit right next to each other under the media menu, the pool window, media bay. But if you understand the relationship between those two, it'll make a lot of things easier, and it'll prevent you from accidentally losing files and moving stuff around when you don't mean to. So let me shift gears here for just a second. Okay, now this is a pretty simple graphic, but a Cubase project, as we're going to see, contains a lot of different component parts, and one of those is the pool. And the pool is where the audio and video for a specific project is stored. But a project's pool contains the stuff for that project and nothing else. So as you use Cubase more and more, you're going to develop a whole lot of projects. Each one is going to have their own pool, and in that pool is the stuff for that project. But in the middle of all of this sits Media Bay, which is kind of like your mothership. And Media Bay is going to interact with every project you ever do, and every project's going to interact with Media Bay. And the reason that these arrows connecting them are bidirectional is that material can move back and forth between Media Bay and a project and vice versa. So, for example, if project 3 over here is something that you're building up with loops from a sequel sound set, okay, those sounds are going to live in Media Bay, and then you're going to import them into your project, or rather into the project's pool from Media Bay. By the same token, if project 4 down here is doing a demo for a band, so you're setting up microphones and recording guitars, that audio is going to stream into your project. It's going to go into the pool for that particular project, and then, assuming that it lives on your hard drive or someplace connected to Media Bay, every time you start the system, Media Bay is going to scan all of the files, and those guitar and vocal parts are then going to be absorbed into Media Bay and be searchable and usable in other projects if you wanted to. So you can kind of think of Media Bay as Google for your music, or Google for your media. There's one Media Bay for all of Cubase, and then an individual pool for each project. Okay, that may seem like a little bit of academic trivia, but with that in your hip pocket, it's going to make more sense, especially as we get into moving material in and out of projects, and eventually to mix down and exporting and sharing and all that kind of stuff. So where files resides becomes more important the more advanced your projects become. So let's go ahead and put away the channel editor and the mix console for now. I'm going to maximize the project window and turn everything on here, and we'll take a quick look around. So using the flyouts at the side of the window here, the one I'm going to leave out, we're not going to turn on the chord pads for the moment, but we'll turn on the, I'm going to turn that back off. We'll deal with Media Bay and VST Instruments in their own chapters. So let's look at the pure project window itself. Now, across the very top here, you've got, I haven't counted them recently, but there's on the order of a dozen menus. It's important to recognize that all of these menus are consistent no matter what window is open. So these don't change just because you're looking at the project window or the mix console and so forth. Now, the first thing that we have available to us is this line, this toolbar up here that has a whole line of icons on it. And we're going to run through what those are. The factory videos do a pretty good job of going icon by icon. But something that I want to point out is that if you come over here into the gray area and right-click, this context menu pops up, and you have the ability to turn on and off all sorts of stuff up here. And you can open up a setup panel, and this lets you see the whole shooting match in one overview. And what's important here is the left menu contains the hidden items, the right contains visible items and their relative position. So this snap quantize is the last icon in the toolbar here. And if I move that up, keep your eye on this Q with the squiggle next to it. And each time I move that up, it's going to slide further and further down the row, and then I can move it down, bring it back over. By the same token, I can come over to the hidden items. Let's say the performance meter, and click the add button and move that to the visible side. And look at this. Now our performance meter, which is just giving you a sense of how hard the processor, the computer is working, is now visible. And similarly, I can take that and move it right and left and so forth. Now, the point here is that your version of Cubase can be configured exactly the way you want it, which means everyone else's can too. So as you're looking at this video series and others, or working with other Cubase users, don't get high-centered on the fact that every icon's not in the same position each time. One of the real luxuries of a program like this is you can make it look exactly the way that you want it to. Same thing we saw at the VST connections. You've got presets down here. So you can, if you have a toolbar set up just the way you want it, you can name that as you wish, and then that's available to call up later. So let me put that away. And you'll notice that if you hover the mouse over each one of these, you're going to get a little yellow sticky note pops up that tells you exactly what it is. So you can see the various components here. But let's come into the Cubase Pro or Cubase menu and open Preferences for just 1 second. If you scroll down through your categories to General, you're going to see this option in the middle for tooltips. If I uncheck that, those little yellow post-it notes go away. But if your Cubase, your instance, isn't showing you the tooltips, open the Cubase menu, turn on Preferences or select Preferences, and then enable Show Tips. And then all you have to do is put your mouse over the top of something and it's going to tell you what it is. So we have our automation controls, our scrolling controls. This is a set of transport controls, and you're going to find that here we go with another set of transport controls. There are a lot of places in Cubase that have redundancies. So you can use these as your fast forward, play, rewind, record, as you can with these, as well as keyboard controls or an outboard controller and so forth. There's no magic. It's or no right answer. It's whichever you prefer. This next block of icons is your basic set of tools. So you've got range selection, cut, glue, erase, etc. And these are pretty self-explanatory. Again, the factory videos cover them. The one thing I want to really point out is that if you come down in the project window itself and right-click and hold, so I'm right-clicking and holding, notice that that toolbar pops up, and I can now slide around and pick something else. When I release, that's going to be the tool that I'm holding. And you're going to find as you do more and more editing in the project window, the ability to do that, to not have to use that floating window, is going to become really important. It keeps you from having to come back up to the top every single time. And one other thing that make sure you're aware of here, you see the arrow, the caret below the selection tool, or I think they call it the object selection. That means there's more there. So if I click, I can drop that down, and the plane arrow gives us a normal sizing. So if I take a piece of audio and let's come to the ruler, click and drag down, zoom way in. All right. Now, if I select a piece of audio with the normal sizing tool and I drag the end of it, it has the effect of cropping the audio. You can see the waveform doesn't change. It's just where the event ends and begins. If I change that to moving contents, okay, you see that it's pushing it into the other end. And time stretch is your third one. That's the one with the little clock face. And now you can see that it's actually going to stretch or crush that audio depending on where I release the point, release the handle. So there's two lessons there. One is that you can do those three things, and that's really cool. But more importantly, if you're trying to do this, you're just trying to crop a piece of audio back, and you find out it's not doing what you want, it's in fact doing this, that can make a really long day. And just bear in mind that if you look closely at the, if you look closely at the arrowhead tool, that's going to tell the answer. And put that back to normal sizing. Then we've got other default settings here for changing the key of your project. This one is pretty critical. That's your snap on and off. And if you're trying to, if we turn snap on, and let's set our ruler to bars and beats to begin with. So there's, click and drag back out. Now if I'm trying to move a piece around, it's going to snap right to the next bar because we've got the snap value set to that. If I turn the snap value off, I can slide it around there anywhere I want. And again, this is one that gets turned on a lot of times when you're not expecting it, where this value gets set to something bizarre, and it can be so frustrating because you're trying to get that piece of music to go someplace it won't go. And this is probably the culprit. The ruler, however, is fairly important. And let's come down here and select our zoom preset to zoom to locators. And if there's one thing you've got to know about the ruler here, it's these two white triangles called locators. And just to keep things simple, I'm going to click on the top half of that to turn off the cycle mode for a moment. These white triangles, the locators, you see below them that they're creating a highlighted area. It's in light blue. That's what Cubase is thinking about. So the most important aspect is that when you go to export or mix down a song, it's only going to do what's right between the locators. And if, for instance, we had a really long reverb tail that went all the way out to here, it's going to stop exporting at that locator and it would be cut off. If our reverb rings to measure 31, we need to make sure that the locator here is set to 31 as well. And if you have this the double-headed arrow in the lower half of the ruler, you can click and drag up and down to zoom in and out. And again, if you don't know that it does that, it can be really frustrating because that's one you can tag by accident and then baffling. So if we move over to the right side here, you've got a drop-down menu for all the different formats that you can put your ruler into. And that really depends on what sort of project you're doing. I would say if you're doing musical stuff, you're going to probably want to stay in bars and beats because that's, among other things, going to be what lines up with your quantized points and your section repeats and all that sort of stuff. The little hashtag right below that, or the diagonal, that divides your track list. You click that, you actually can split your screen into two pieces. And this is handier than you would think. It would allow you to keep all of your administrative tracks, like your marker track and ruler track and stuff up top, and your audio elsewhere. Or how we use it an awful lot when we're doing voiceover stuff is if we've got a whole bunch of tracks that need to be edited, we'll split the window and move the active one down, make it real big for editing, and then the others can kind of stay up in the top half for an archive. So the last section I want to look at here is the track inspector and the visibility tab. And the inspector is going to change depending on which track you have selected. So we'll just pick an audio track here, the rhythm guitar. You've got a whole series of nested tabs, and you click on one tab, the other ones close up, and it's going to let you do all your editing relative to that topic, so chords or track versions, etc. One thing I want to point out, the fact that the end of the tab is illuminated blue tells you that there are insert effects active on that track. You can also click this to bypass all of them in one shot. Now, if you have a whole bunch of inserts, that's not as effective because it's bypassing the whole bunch. If you want to bypass one and not the other, you need to come in here and do it individually. Now, their individual states, when they're active, are going to be different depending on the individual tab, but everything looks yellow when it's bypassed. So at the very bottom is another gear icon. And if we click that, it's going to bring up an audio track inspector. And here again, we see the same basic convention that we did with the toolbar. We can configure our track inspector to look however we want it to. So, and while we're on that topic, let's move over to the track list itself. At the very bottom here, another gear icon and another configuration window for your track settings. And this one, and we're about to do a whole thing on tracks, but you can select which type of track at the top and then what controls you want visible in the body of the window. We'll get into the rest of this on a track-by-track basis in the next chapter, but the biggest thing to take away from that is, one, the fact that you can configure all these things, and two, that anytime you see a gear icon throughout Cubase, that means you're going to have some sort of a configuration option there. Then really the last thing I want to look at here just briefly is the visibility function. This was new in version 7. And the bigger your projects get, the more useful or necessary this becomes. And at the moment, you can see that every type of track, all of our various tracks are visible, but we have the option to turn off individual tracks this way. Now, you're not muting them. You're not deleting them. They'll still play back. They'll still do all their stuff. You're just not seeing them on the screen. This is just simply to clean up your working environment so you can focus on the task at hand. And here again, if we turn something off and we go, what did I just do? I can't. What the heck was that? I can come here and undo visibility change, and it's going to pop back in. The other thing that we can do is open this filter icon, or open the same thing right there, and you can turn off entire classes of tracks. So if I want to hide all of my VCA fader tracks, I can do that. If I want to hide all my audio tracks, I can do that. And then anytime a filter is active, this turns amber. So if you're going, hey, wait a minute, I'm missing a bunch of stuff, that yellow colorization up there should tell you you're intentionally hiding or suppressing some visibility. The key there is again twofold. One is it gives you great capability, especially with larger projects, to skinny down what you're looking at and see everything you need and nothing you don't. The flip side of that is you sit down and you can't find stuff before you panic and think all is lost. Make sure you check out the visibility tab, the filters, and the visibility agents, and make sure that you've got everything enabled and visible before you determine that you've got a real problem. So we will come back in the next chapter and start looking at these individual tracks and their inspectors in more detail. But that's the overview of the major players, and that should set us up well for a couple of chapters coming on down the road that go into greater detail about the interface between all of those. So I'll meet you back here shortly for Chapter 4.